I'm Addison Brazil. Grief Club, the podcast starts now. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Grief Club, the podcast, where I take the parts of my book, First Year of Grief Club, A Gift from a Friend Who Gets It, and use them as launching points for deeper conversations with experts and friends. Today, we are very lucky to have a huge support in the grief community with us. Please welcome Litsa Williams to the show. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad that you are here. So in Grief Club tradition, the first thing we do is kind of drop into the space, take a deep breath, and I'm going to ask you in one word right now, how are you feeling physically?
One word. I mean, probably the word that is always true for me, unfocused. I have ADHD, so I'm almost at every moment, like 27 different directions. And that's where I am right now.
Feel that? Say tired. Yeah. And one word, how are you feeling emotionally?
Oh, emotionally connected.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've had a lot of good connection with people this week. And so I've
Mm,
just been feeling emotionally really kind of in a connected place.
love that. I'm going to say hopeful. And lastly, how are you feeling mentally?
Mentally unfocused really is tricky because it kind of goes into both, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm gonna say mentally pretty stimulated. I've had a pretty I've done a lot of stuff today. So yeah.
Love that. I'm going to say focused. So let's hop in. So the first thing I always like to do is just give you a few minutes to kind of honor your journey openly, just letting us know who you are and what happened to get you to where you are today and how you show up in the world. And I'll let you explain a little bit of what you've been working on and all that. So I will hand it to you. Let's get to know Litsa.
Sure. So I'm one of those people who I think grief has been parts of my life in a different way since a really young age. I think probably the part of my grief story that people who are familiar with What's Your Grief know best starts when I was 18. My dad died when I was 18, and that was a very formative loss, I guess, in a lot of ways in terms of where how grief impacted my family and then where things turned. I think grief was a big part of my family before that. My parents had a baby that was stillborn when I was 4 and were, really amazing open parents who, I remember well talking to that, when that happened and
Mm,
that they didn't shy away from that. They didn't have that attitude of like, you keep kids away from that. They couldn't have. Obviously, my mom had been pregnant. I was excited, for a brother who was coming. So it's not like they could have hidden it from me, but they definitely made it part of the conversation. Even then, we always went to his grave in the cemetery and from when I was really young. And so I think that for me was, grief was a fairly comfortable thing to talk about from early on in my family. And when I was 7, my very best friend, who was the son of my mom's best friend, his so my mom's best friend died, so my best friend's mom, and that was again this other huge, really significant loss that again I look back now, especially now being in the grief space and knowing how differently or how many different ways there are to experience grief in childhood and how families handle it and what happens, the culture around grief. I've come to appreciate even more what a good job my parents did
mm,
in different ways. Again, at that they were really direct. They had really good, clear conversations. I knew that she was going to die. I went to the funeral and it was, talking about that loss was huge. And then even as we got a little bit older, my best friend's dad got remarried when we were 9, which felt like devastating all over again. And my family did a really good job of sort of talking about all of the stuff that comes with that. And so I had all of those things that had happened before my dad died. But when my dad died, it was obviously sort of a different level of loss for me personally in this very personal way. And I was 18 and, that's a weird age in general, I think, are really kind of in that place where you're an adult sort of, and you're still sort of in your childhood space. I had just finished my freshman year in college. So, it was where I was. And after my dad's death, I think a huge thing that has affected what's your grief and where things went is that my sister, who was about 6 years younger than me, within a very short period, probably within a year and a half after my dad's death, she developed a really severe heroin addiction, and that really kind of devastated our family in this completely different way. And I
Mm,
became really tuned in to how you can grieve someone who's still alive, and how there are so many different types of loss beyond bereavement. And wow, this like it really makes me start to sound like a really like griefy person, as I'll end up then the last thing that I think really ended up shaping where I am now. So when I was 26, my sister's partner, who was like a member of our family, who had lived with our family for a while and things, he died of an overdose. And that had obviously a devastating impact on my sister, but on my entire family as well. And also was this way where I saw how not only was the some of the challenges of grieving substance related deaths different, but just how other people
mhm,
dealt with it. And this was a long time ago. I mean, this was, in the early days of at least white middle class people talking about the opioid epidemic and the way that
mm,
it shifted. And so, this was in the mid 2000s, and there wasn't nearly as much support and awareness around addiction within families, around substance related death, and all of that. So ultimately, when I ended up later, I didn't ever have a moment where I thought, oh yeah, I'm gonna go into grief. I didn't. I tried therapy and support groups, and they were like not for me. I was not
mm,
somebody who was like so moved by the grief support that I received that I decided I wanted to get into this space. I took kind of a winding road around to ending up in the work I'm in now, but ultimately started working for an organization where I was working with families who were really experiencing, like in the worst moment, traumatic and unexpected loss. So I would meet families at the hospital,
mm,
usually be in the meeting with the doctor, unfortunately letting them know that the person in their life had died. And we're based in Baltimore, and a lot of those deaths were homicide, suicide, overdose, but then also accidents, strokes, um, occasionally heart attacks, things like that. So it was a range. And then we were working with folks for up to 2 years, sometimes more after that. So it gave this really interesting, I guess, a way of connecting with grief support, because I wasn't in a role where people were seeking out the support. Like I was assigned to them at the hospital. And
mm,
so I had this range of some people who were like, yes, I want the counseling, I want the groups, I want everything. And then there were other people who were like, no, absolutely not. Like, no, no. And so, which I really understood those people, because that
mm.
was sort of, me in my own grief. And so that's where I met Eleanor, the co-founder of What's Your Grief. And that's where we sort of started having these conversations about like what's out there for people who don't want counseling and support groups, what's available online. Like so many people wanted stuff online. This was back in the late 2000s. I guess Eleanor and I met there in 2009.
Mm,
The online landscape looked very different then when it comes to grief, and so we were really struggled, and ultimately we complained for a few years, and then finally we're like, well, what can we do about this? And blogs were still huge, so we started blogging,
mm.
and really it was just a grief blog that turned into What's Your Grief, eventually, that turned into what it is now. It's grown in so many ways, but we've always sort of said, our tagline has always been grief support for the rest of us, because it was sort of this space to try to fill these gaps we saw for maybe what wasn't already there in the grief support space. So that's the very long answer to
I love
me.
it. I'm so glad you gave us the long answer. And the launching point of this episode, the week in the book, is about pro-social shame and community. So it couldn't be more perfect, because I think sometimes as far as you get is just Googling, grief support. And like you said, it comes up with the things that don't always work for all of us. And it's so funny that as you say that too, I've obviously been in situations in my life, and my listeners are no stranger to the Grief Olympics, so don't worry to overwhelm them. Sounds like you're a fellow Olympian. I remember it's funny that you said that both times with my dad died by suicide and then my friend in a traumatic accident. And the person who came to speak to me in the hospital at that time, like the trauma specialist, the grief
Mhm.
informed trauma specialist. And it's just so funny that as you were saying that, I I cannot like put a face. I couldn't ID that person. And they were so integral at that moment, but you're just so in shock. And so I loved when you said, I think I might have had the opportunity with my father back in Canada, but I don't think here in LA I had that opportunity to then continue to meet with that person that sort of held you and met you at that really, sort of breaking down what the world means to you in that moment, like it's really right there. But it's so interesting because even as you said it, I got this weird memory, and I can remember like where my mom was sitting in like the room, but the lovely woman who was speaking to me in the hospital, I can't remember her face, the sound of her voice. I just remember she was explaining to me the one thing that I didn't want anyone to explain to me, in that moment. So it's like what an interesting and beautiful position to be in terms of getting to see grief also be born in people, because it's the moment of conception, let's call it, of having to navigate and live with loss that you obviously didn't want to have.
Yeah, it is. It's such a I worked in that job for 8 years, and I always, say to people, there's almost nothing I can imagine like it, because you truly realize that you're just sitting with people on what will probably be the or one of the worst days of their life. And they, to let you into that space, not that they've invited you in per
Mm,
se, but oftentimes you are the person who is there in that space. And um an incredible it's an incredible thing to be a part of that with families, and to be able to sit with it. And you truly you so often in the grief space, you hear all this, don't try to fix it, don't try to fix it, don't, but there is, no moment more, I think, than in that moment where you just know, like, there is nothing in this moment that we can do other than be there and be present, and
mm,
allow people to know that they're not alone in what comes next from here. But other than that, there's no magic words, there's no comfort, there's no, thing that can make that moment, change the trajectory of their grief. I think there's just being able to be present with people, because like you say, so many people, it's a blur. Like,
mm,
they don't remember. They, half of the time you're in that same conversation repeating things again and again, because one of our brain's self-protective mechanisms is to shut off and just say,
mhm.
I'm not going to hear this. And then suddenly people will need you to repeat things again and again, because we can't process it all. And yeah, it was a really, really interesting job that I'm really grateful I had, and I know, and that Eleanor and I both had, I know, shaped so much of what we do with What's Your Grief.
Absolutely. All right, I'm so excited, but I have to ask you the question that I ask everybody. If a child walked up to you and they didn't know what the word grief meant, and they asked you, what's grief mean? How would you explain it to them?
I would say that grief is learning to live in the world after you've lost something so important to you.
I love that. A learning process. I really do love that.
You've reached Grief Club. Leave a message after the beep.
Hey, Grief Club, it's Justin Michael Williams. And for those of you who wanted to meditate or learn to meditate, I just wanted to leave you this message to let you know that I have a free meditation album out that you can access on Spotify, Apple Music, and anywhere. There are 10 tracks for you to enjoy about feeling your feelings, getting shit done, and taking action in your life. You can find it at meditationforthepeople.com. I love you. Talk to you soon.
I do want to jump in further on sort of this idea of this searching for a community aspect with, because you seem to have so much experience in it, but like unexpected and traumatic loss. We actually haven't talked about that much on this podcast, and I'm generally interviewing, so I'm not talking about mine that much unless it's like, a tidbit that really works or will support the conversation at the time. But I'd love to hear just more of of what you offer to people, and maybe what your take is on when there's that extra element of something traumatic and very unexpected happening on top of, just losing somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that is helpful um, is when, because trauma is so complex, right? That we can all experience something potentially traumatic, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we are traumatized or we develop post-traumatic stress. And I
Mhm.
think that it can get really muddy for people to understand. But one of the things for me that's always been really important in helping people think about where they are and what support they need, what's going to help them, is that certain types of traditional grief support, if there is, or if there are components of trauma, of real clinical trauma going on, the stuff that we do for grief and that can help to support people grieving sometimes is really inaccessible if we haven't worked on the trauma stuff first. And so I think understanding that trauma, like part of the core piece of trauma, is that something has happened to us that has destabilized everything so much that we are living in a place of fear, right? The world no longer seems safe to us. And that shows up in so many different ways. But one of the things that, of course, I think is probably one of the signs of trauma people know about are flashbacks and nightmares. People think of things like that oftentimes. And I think that's one where we can really see how some of the traditional grief support might not work if I'm in a place where every time I think about the person who died, all I can think about is the scene of the accident or how I found them. Even if you didn't see them, we can
Mhm.
experience the way trauma can show up for us. Even if you read a police report or somebody described something to you, it can still become the thing that gets stuck in our brains, and we replay it over and over. So now all of a sudden in this grief space where we're talking about how do we connect to continued bonds and memories, and how do we create legacy, and that's just not going to work if
Mhm.
every time I think about the person, I'm replaying things that are so distressing to me. If I'm also realizing that, my own safety in the world, the way I perceive my support system has been jeopardized. So if I feel like no one can understand what I am going through, and no one in the world is safe any longer, maybe, for all of the reasons that can come up, we know that community and connection is such an important part of how we grieve, and the things that in grief support we're often trying to promote. But if I haven't found ways to really work on some of that trauma piece that's going to allow me to feel a sense of safety, to reach out in ways to other people that are going to feel okay for me, thrusting it in to kind of some of the things that might happen with grief just aren't going to work. And so we really just encourage people to think about those things, think about the way that it might be showing up in ways where, if traditional grief support stuff, you're like, how could I ever do that when all these devastating images come up in my mind? Or, I can't even imagine that sometimes, especially if your loss was a potentially traumatizing loss, if there was violence, if it was unexpected, if you feel like it could have been prevented, if it was in the media. I mean, there's so many things that statistically increase the likelihood that something could be potentially traumatic. We always say, just go and talk to somebody, get screened for some of that, see if maybe some trauma treatment is going to be really helpful for you before you start diving into some of these, or alongside of diving into some of this meaning making and memory making and kind of telling your story. So I think that's a really important piece of trauma. There's just so much too of unexpected deaths where we're just absorbing things, where when a death is anticipated, there's no comparison. It's not like one is easier or harder than the other. They're just different. But one of the things that happens is we just have to take a lot more time sometimes to be absorbing the shock that that person is gone. Our brain hasn't done some of the practicing that it tries to do in anticipatory grief, of imagining, okay, how will I deal with this when he's not here? Or what will I do about that? we haven't had any of that. And so sometimes we're on a different timeline than other people who have had anticipated deaths. And it feels like maybe they're ready to do certain things in terms of legacy and connection much more quickly than we might be if we're still playing some of that catch up with unexpected loss. So, those are just a few quick things, but I always like that. Those are, I think, the ones from working with people with unexpected losses. I think those are some of the things that I always try to remind people.
Mm.
And that trauma really is a space where getting professional support is really important. Grief is a normal and natural human response to loss. It's not a pathology. It's not a problem to solve, as I'm sure all your listeners know well. It is this experience of living our lives after a loss. And so many people can do that without professional support. They're able to navigate that with just the support of friends and family, with figuring out memories and connections. And it doesn't necessarily need that. A huge part of what we do on What's Your Grief is that we give all these creative tools. We do things for writing and photography and connecting with other people and, learning about grief in ways that can really help. And that can really work. But if trauma is a component, that's when we're like, talking to a therapist. I know it can be a big leap for people, but it really is so, so important in the cases of trauma.
Absolutely. And I think just by having this conversation, Jay, you're proving in itself that this was community that I didn't have. And I think community and connection are the only reason I'm here through my own suicidality and through my own losses. However, when I was in the face of that capital T trauma, specifically after finding my father and also being there for my friend's death, there was this isolation to that I almost felt like I didn't have access to my own community. So just being able to hear something like this, I know would have meant so much. And as you're talking, I'm like nodding ferociously because it's sort of like all of those things were a part of that trauma. And I would often try to help explain to people, because with my brother's death, like you said, it was cancer. He had cancer for 4 years. Things were explained to me, like, it was just very different. And sometimes I'm even weirdly quoted as saying it was a beautiful death because we sort of knew what was happening. It was a sunny day, 12 of us gathered around him, and we were there. Whereas these other ones felt more like, where were you when Kennedy got shot moments? Like, what do you mean? Like, what's going on, sort of thing. And so I would try to explain to people that I was nowhere near where the rituals of their support there when they were offered to me. I was still dealing with like the loss of a human life that was traumatic after my father for a long time before it became anything about my dad and me and not having my dad anymore, and I don't think that gets talked about that much. It's a long time out. And similarly with my friend, because I was also injured so badly, I had to be in survival mode of myself, like learning how to walk and getting through my own brain injury. And it was so far down the road where I had this moment where I just went, oh my God, she's not here, and it was so far away and it felt so foreign and so isolating. And there wasn't really community around those moments of, not only when you're in the trauma, and obviously that's when we're leaning on our professional help the most, but also people just recognizing that it really wasn't something that was there for me. So I'm so glad if you're hearing this and you're going, yeah, I feel like I don't even have access to sort of like the things I'm reading in grief books or the things they're talking about at grief support group. And there was that unexpected element or that traumatic element, years. And I was going to actually bring up today, because we're so close to Father's Day and we both lost our fathers, and the club I hate to be in, but here we are. And I found weirdly this Father's Day, this past Sunday, where are we at, 2012, so 11 years later, was this weirdly emotionally raw day that I just did not think I was going to be having 12 years later. And I found myself even saying, Addison, this, like almost getting irritated with myself. I'm like, this. And it's a lot of what we're saying, where it takes so long to heal from that trauma, where I'm only just having access to a normal day with real life grief by something that's meant to trigger just grief, not trauma, finally. and sitting in that and being with that. So I just really appreciate you sort of going through all of that with us and talking about that, because again, the only time we've probably ever heard it is when we're in that hospital room and we can't hear anything because we're in shock, and someone's
Yeah.
explaining it the first time. So I think knowing a community exists when you're dealing with trauma is essential as well, even if you're leaning more on the professional help. But hearing conversations like this, where it's like, whoa, they felt completely removed, because it kind of feels like, do I not care about the person? Why don't I have those grief feelings yet? Like, and
Yeah.
it's not that at all. It's like you're
No.
literally dealing with witnessing the traumatic
It,
death, or trying to. And my sister, I'm sure, will listen to this. We always went back and forth out of what was harder, because she had to imagine everything I told her that I saw, and I knew what I saw and what it was true. So my flashbacks were memories, and hers
yeah.
were things she was making up and when she was sleeping and unconsciously. And I always kind of was like wondering, I'm like, I don't know, that might be worse, because she doesn't know, because everything's a nightmare for her. She's making up
Yeah.
all of it,
Yeah.
whereas for me, it was like, that's not what happened on that day, or that is
Yeah.
what happened and I'm having a flashback or whatever it was. But it's very interesting to hear that it can also affect people so deeply, even if they just, like you said, read about it or hear about it, or.
Yeah. And I think that the self-compassion, like that ability that comes through learning about trauma and learning about grief, to be able to understand what you're experiencing, to give yourself grace and compassion around it, when, no matter how many years it's been that, these things show up for us. But one of the things that's really interesting about some trauma research is that when people don't understand their trauma responses are trauma responses,
Mm,
and they fear them. I mean, there's fearing the events, the trauma, the lack of safety, but then there's fearing our own experience. There's fearing what's happening to us, like being scared of the thoughts we're having and the emotions and the isolation, the suicidality, all the things that can happen. Um, Interestingly, that, well, not interestingly, probably unsurprisingly, right? Like that uh, exacerbates trauma symptoms. It makes it
mm,
harder to cope. And in the grief research, when we have false expectations about grief, like if we believe it's going to unfold like the 5 stages, or we
mhm,
think that after a certain amount of time that it's going to have dissipated or whatever, that also predicts that we will have a harder time adjusting to our grief after
mm.
we've lost somebody. And so I think, like, when you put those two things together, and you do have people who are experiencing trauma and sometimes going, and why am I not even remembering the person, because I'm so wrapped up, like, why doesn't my grief look right, and why is my trauma so devastating? Because I think even when we know theoretically that trauma exists, when you're experiencing it yourself, it's a
Mm.
completely different ball game. And so I think, those two things together can be really, really hard to build self-compassion and to say, wait, no, this is, of course, I'm having a trauma response. I went through this traumatic experience, and my body and my brain are just trying to regain safety in the world. And, of course, after this many years, it's still hard sometimes on Father's Day, because it's hard, and because I
Mm.
had all these other things that were part of this, the circumstances for me. And so I think sometimes that's why I think we believe in psychoeducation so much, is because when we give people information, sometimes it helps us to be more compassionate with ourselves and know that, like, this is, yeah, God, it's awful, but this is how it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And just being able to hear that, and even if someone's heard it before, as I'm listening to all of this, nodding, it's like I need all these reminders once again this week for the 1,000th time in the row. And that's one of my favorite things about doing the show and sitting in this seat is I had so much resistance to hopping on today, because I did have that rough Father's Day, and I just like didn't know if I just didn't want to. And then there's the other part of me that just goes, yeah, but what happens every time you do? What happens
Yes.
when you do show up to, in this case, the community I built?
Yeah.
It's like, it's, and even there's that resistance to identifying with it and sitting in it, even though it is a safe space and it is where conversations that make sense like this can happen. And, we can see, I think sometimes there can be a little bit of a resistance to seeing ourselves in others and identifying with our grief anymore and wanting it all to go away. And like you said it a few times, like I've literally in big bold letters on the back of my book, it says grief is not something you fix, it's something you honor. And I every week go, but what if we could fix it this week? Like, what if we could?
Wouldn't it be good to know the next Father's Day was going to be easier?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like it's that like you're saying, that loving part of you that has to go, yeah, that's a good one. Like almost when a kid's trying out jokes for the first time and they're not funny, but you're like, we're like, okay, well, yeah, that's the idea of a joke. You're getting there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I thank you for reminding us to be gentle, especially, and this reminder for me too. It's like you said, it's not been 12 years. It's been all the years of processing trauma, and then probably a few years of
Yeah.
just where I have access to grief, just grief feelings and that sort of loss. So that's incredibly helpful to know. I'm curious when you say grief support for the rest of us, what are some of your favorites of what that means in terms of what you guys have been able to provide, or what's really resonating with people outside of, like you said, the grief group counseling that most people are offered?
Yeah, sure. So I think probably the thing that we've been doing the longest and have a real soft spot for, because it was part of what Eleanor and I connected over, was using photography as a tool for grief. And so very early on, we started offering exploring grief through photography classes, online classes, and classes together. But one of the things that we were really interested in was just things that don't involve words, that don't necessarily involve having to find language for our loss and our loss experiences. I think sometimes there are many moments in our grief that we can't find the words for. And the history of mental health has unfortunately privileged the idea of talking. And that's because Freud was like, you've got to express it. You got to express it. You've got to put it all into words. But there's no research that actually shows that that's true. We can't avoid. So that's important. But as long as we're finding ways to access and connect with and process our experiences and emotions, there is nothing that shows that we have to say them out loud. And so I think that for us has been really important, and being able to say, if talking works for you, like, please do it. And now I'm a huge believer. I've always been a believer in therapy, but I love therapy and my therapist now. I think therapy is so valuable. And I also know that when we're talking about things that aren't in themselves pathologies, when we're talking about something like grief, there's so many other ways. Photography, so many people talk about just going into the world and, like, after a loss, seeing grief everywhere, just like seeing it in nature, seeing it walking down the street, just seeing the world differently, or seeing something that captures one's internal experience. And we really, loved that ourselves. And so that was where we started. And it was interesting that we started talking about it, and then other people were like, yes, me too, or yeah, I'm really interested in that. And so that kind of grew its own space of being able to help people tap into that. We have other creative expression projects that we really like too. We have a grief recipes where people can share like how they cook to connect with people who died, and like the recipe I'm writing. But I think the other big thing that we really do is we've tried to create like our hub community, that kind of like our membership community that people can join aside from our website, which is like just hundreds of articles and podcasts and all that. It's a space where people sometimes, I think, are kind of confused. They're like, well, if it's not a support group, like what goes on there? And we really try to have it to be a place that is everything. Like, you can join that space and you can just watch webinars because you just like to learn about grief, and you don't have to be on camera, and you don't have to identify, you don't have to do anything at all, just because you want to learn. And then we have places for people who are just looking for kind of a little accountability for like the things in life that are hard after loss. So like on Sundays, we just get together and we have, I call it getting things done together. And we get on Zoom, and it's 2 hour block. And we spend the first 5 minutes where everybody just says, what are you doing for the next 2 hours? And sometimes it's like laundry or meal prep or dealing with estate stuff I haven't dealt with, or I'm actually going to journal because I've been talking about journaling all week, but I never actually follow through with it. And everybody just kind of keeps each other accountable and then goes off in their own spaces and does their own thing. We check in halfway through, check in at the end. But we don't talk about, nobody has to talk about their feelings. Nobody has to talk about grief, but it's just like, let's come and do the things that are just harder because grief makes life harder.
I love that. I
We,
love that so, so, so much. That is born of somebody who gets it. Those are friends who get it. It's we have this term in like my family and my friends, we call them like, I need a pocket pal today, which is sort of like I don't want to talk about it, but I want someone to come with me to do all my errands. Which like, and my
totally.
friends know exactly what that means. Like, I really need a pocket pal. Like, and I just had it with some stuff I had to do with my house here, and it was just like literally like it is just so much different if somebody will just accompany you through the things that need to get done, but that it's not like a hindrance or you don't have to explain why or talk about why, but you just like need that accountability in that pocket. But I think that's so wonderful and also can be something that can be supportive, like you said, of people who are more in that traumatic zone as well, because you're not hashing it out and trying to solve anything in these sort of pedestrian group sessions that can happen as
Yeah.
well.
And you don't have to take on other people's stuff. I think one of the
Yes.
things that gets underestimated about support groups are wonderful. And for some people, they are just like, they're life changing, they're perfect. But it also means you have to be in a place to be able to hear other people's stories. And that is hard. Like,
Mhm.
oftentimes in grief and in trauma, we're just trying to figure out how to live with our own story. And now having to take on other people's stories, we're not always ready for that. And so spaces that are like, you can show up, you can know that everybody here knows, right? We're all grieving. We all know that. We all know like life is really hard right now. And we don't have to, in this space, talk about why. We don't have to share our own stuff or take on anybody else's, but we can still be here for a different kind of support. And I think that's something that's really important to us that is hard to find in, yeah,
Hmm.
hard to find
And
in mental health.
that's the grief dichotomy. I feel like if you feel that way, that you can't be a container for somebody else, it's probably on a day where you need a container. And that's
Totally.
such a hard stress to be like, I need to show up and I want to share or get whatever type of support, but I cannot take on anymore. And
Yes.
and there are days, and people don't talk about this a lot because it's very like anti, mental health guru, but there are days, and I was a big peer support advocate, obviously, and still am, but there are days, yeah, where you're like, I cannot listen to someone else. I like I'm too empathetic to know that you're in this amount of pain. Like the only thing I like about this right now is I think I'm the only one in some ways. Like I just
Yeah.
in some ways it's so freeing and it's so beautiful and it's like, but there are days where you go, I cannot sit in someone else's grief. I can barely stand in my own today. And that's just a very real thing that it doesn't feel like safe to say in many spaces. And I'm so glad that we're just like stumbling into mentioning that because I think
Oh,
hearing that
yeah.
will change things for a lot of people. So
Yeah, it's so
love that.
important to like know our own boundaries with that sort of thing because we're not doing a service for anybody if we
Hmm.
can't know ourselves that of course there are times where we're going to be tapped out, where like we're just not going to be able to, and that's okay. Like that's not a
Hmm.
failure. Again, that is just being a human who has limitations in the world.
Yeah, that's real. And I'm working that out right now too, because it's hard no matter where you are socially. People, are interested and or friends kind of want to brag and be like, well, Addison wrote a book about grief. And I kind of like kick them under the table because I'm like, I will now be listening to the last three people that this person lost for the rest of this dinner. And
Hmm.
I just left recording a podcast on both sides of it and writing my second book. Like I didn't come to West Hollywood to talk about death.
Yep.
But it is that beautiful thing that it connects us and like so finding that balance. And I've definitely been working on those boundaries as well as I'm sure as everyone else is sitting there right now going, yeah, okay, I could be a little bit more vocal with that. Last question on this. If you're having one of those days where the grief is piling up, I mean, because you've just digested so much knowledge and resources and experiential, what when that's hitting like that, what is your next 5 minutes to an hour look like? Like what is the immediate, how do you take care of yourself when you're going into sort of overwhelm, in the weeds of it?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's what I do that is not my ideal, which is I start like scrolling endlessly on Instagram, which is the worst. It's what I don't recommend, but it's like the easy thing. And I think this is for so many, like there's so many things, right? It's like why it would be easier to just like grab a beer or scroll on Instagram, like those things that are like instant. I am as guilty as the next person of that being my go-to because I know it's like what just gets my brain to kind of check out.
Mm-hmm.
So usually what I try to do in that moment, especially on my phone, I will first and foremost, I love Headspace, the app Headspace. So I'll be like, all right, Headspace meditation. That is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna put something on. It can be short. And I'm a big believer in, whatever it is that my brain wants to do, whether that's like scroll endlessly on Instagram or just do, something that checks my brain out. Rarely when I'm pivoting to let me listen to a meditation am I like thinking, okay, I have to definitely shift gears completely. I'm like, and then permission that once I've done the meditation, if I want to scroll on Instagram or, check out and binge television, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But usually, once you've actually gotten yourself in a place of giving that break, for me at least, if I can like break myself from the thing that wants to just zone my brain out, I will listen to that meditation. And then I'm usually like, okay, let me go outside. And then like once I can do that and go outside, for me, that's the huge thing is just to like get that space and not put any pressure. This is the luxury of self-employment. It doesn't always work on days that, I have certain things that are scheduled, but a lot of my days I do a combination of things that are self-scheduled and I give myself permission to regroup for the rest of the day and to say, wait, if I've been in overload because I've been going through, reading and responding to so many comments, or I've been, doing stuff that really has then tapped into something about my own grief that has been a lot. I'm like, I give myself permission to shift gears for the day. And there's no, just because I said this is what I was going to do today does not mean this is what I'm going to actually end up doing. I think it's probably a little easier for me than some people because as I said in the beginning, I do have ADHD. And so I've spent a lot of my life learning how to work in the times that it works for my brain and know
Mm-hmm.
that planning what a day looks like doesn't actually always end up being what the day looks like. Like that's been a huge thing for me and just learning to work with my own brain my whole life. But it really is something that I try to bring in when I know that I'm overloaded or overwhelmed or, just feeling like I need that space is to give myself permission to say, forget about, what I thought today was going to look like. I'm just going to do whatever I need to get through.
Mm-hmm. And how odd and beautiful that as you're saying that sirens go in the background because it's a perfect metaphor and example of we don't know what's about to trigger us or not trigger us at any moment of any time. And I can see that we're naturally moving into the segue of find the funny, which is how we end up the episode. I laugh at moments like that where I'm like, literally as she's saying it, it's like, the triggers are driving by kind of thing. But
Yep.
where do you find the funny? I mean, this can be just like who your favorite comedian is right now, the last time you laughed so hard, your stomach hurt. Like, does humor weave its way through all of this for you? I get the sense that you're like, my people. Just
Oh yes, humor definitely does. Eleanor and I
okay.
talk about this all the time. We were just at the National Alliance for Children's Grief Conference, and there was this woman there, and she said she sort of made something that was like the tiniest of jokes, and she was like, "I'm sorry. I hope that I was like, oh." Girl, you could not, even if you tried, make a
Yeah.
joke that would like ever offend us in the grief space. Because I think, I can slam Freud earlier for saying that we have to talk about our feelings when we don't. But Freud also said that humor was the most advanced and developed of all the defense mechanisms. Freud
Look at
loved humor.
me. Look at
He
me.
used tons of
Advanced.
humor himself, which I think like is really critical. But I think for me, Eleanor and I, one of the things that we both love are like any sort of, and maybe this is because the we worked in the end of life sort of death space like as well and in hospital settings, but the the books, All My Friends Are Dead and All My Friends Are Still Dead. I don't know if you know these books, but they are these hilarious little cartoon books that sit in our office. And I will, like, if for any reason I'm having a bad day, I will sometimes just like flip through and they will crack me up. And I sometimes get self-conscious when they're sitting out. If we're doing like a workshop or a training or something like that, I'm like, maybe we should have put those away. But you know, so I think those to me are just something that like specifically for whatever reason popped to mind when you said it. But I think, the other thing is that this industry makes me laugh a lot. I mean, I think that there is just like a lot of weird pretend. There's a lot of weird like language. Like there are just things. There are people with very dramatic language around things, and I'm like, we can just talk about grief like normal humans. Like we don't have to use like fancy language and pastel tones and tone, I don't know, tilt our heads all the time. Like, and so I honestly, like, part of it is just like, I am like, what is going on? Like, can't we just be humans? So that actually is the other thing that in a weird way makes me laugh a lot. Like, I will look at something and I'll be like, why did we make something so simple so complicated? Like we used all of this like terminology and stuff like that. And it happens in all parts of the grief space, like the National Funeral Directors Convention. It's like a 6,000 person funeral directors conference. And you go there and you're like, oh God, funeral directors have their own like weird lingo and all their own weird stuff. And I don't know, that phenomenon to me.
That sounds like a comedy gold mine, actually.
It
6,000 funeral directors in one place. Oh my gosh. I gotta go just to go.
Oh my God.
Write a sitcom about that.
And I just pro tip, it's in Vegas this coming year. So if you're gonna go to one,
the real mix, funeral directors and Vegas's finest.
I highly recommend you go to the one in Vegas because I've seen it in Philly and in Baltimore. And if I can't even imagine how next level it will be in Vegas, because it is just, you walk in and there are just like it's like a caskets as far as the eye can see, and then it's hearses like you're on a car showroom of all the different like hearses and all the stuff that they sell in funeral homes, like any memorial item you could ever imagine is there. It is, I mean, the first time I went there, I must have looked like a deer in the headlights, because I was like, I've only ever been to like therapy conferences and hospice conference, like which are a very different vibe. And I was just like, whoa, this is all these funeral directors, more men in suits than you'll see anywhere. So I highly recommend it just for the
you want to find the funny kids, go to the National Funeral Directors Conference in Vegas. I think that actually sounds like, I'm pretty sure I could get a book or a TV pitch out of just being one weekend there. I'm pretty sure something would
you unquestionably could. Like, I can assure you that you definitely could. It is, it's I think it's even outside death, right? Like any industry, like, people who work in like pool sales or who work in like, you just know, like everybody creates their own little like world and their little language and their little thing. And sometimes when you walk into one of those bubbles and you're just like, what is going on here? Oh my God.
Fascinating. Especially coming at it from your perspective. All right. Well, I can tell I could keep you here all day, but I won't. Where can people find you guys?
Oh yeah, they can find us at whatsyourgrief.com, and then all of our social medias are just at What's Your Grief, and then we also have a book called What's Your Grief. So we make it very easy. What's your grief all around?
What's your grief all around? And for anybody listening, do give them a follow, and the resources are insanely helpful. So thank you for all of that, and thanks for being a friend who gets it. I love these conversations where you just can tell right away we're going to get into it, but we're going to laugh, we're going to find the middle, and do what we do. As the music plays us out, one word for how you're feeling to check out. I'll go first, so you have the last word. I'm going to say connected. I'll throw it to you.
I'm excited. I just like have one of those feelings where I'm excited to go into the rest of the day.
I love that. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Well, Grief Club, that's the show. If you enjoyed it, please let us know by liking and leaving a review. This will help as many people who may need what we're talking about find it the fastest. Remember to honor the journey, and when that gets tough, find the funny.